Hello everyone, I know many of you listen while falling asleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, settle in, and dive into tonight's case. Tonight we are going to a place where the air is always heavy. A place where the music never stops. Where the smell of gumbo and crawfish drifts from the open windows of shotgun houses. Where the oak trees drip with Spanish moss and the streetcars rattle down tracks that have not changed in 100 years. We are going to New Orleans. The Crescent City. A place that has survived plagues, floods, wars, and hurricanes. A city that knows suffering better than most and has always responded suffering with the same stubborn defiance. It plays music. It dances. It throws parades for the living and for the dead. New Orleans is not a city that is easily frightened. It has stared down yellow fever. It has stared down the Mississippi River itself. But in the spring of 1918, something came to New Orleans that the city had never faced before. Something it could not dance away. Something it could not drown out with a brass band. It came in the dark. It came through the back doors of houses while families slept. It came with a chisel and an axe. And it left behind scenes so terrible that even the most hardened police officers in the city had to look away. They called him the Axeman. No one ever learned his real name. No one ever saw his face clearly. No one ever caught him. And for more than a year, the entire city of New Orleans lived in a kind as hard to imagine today. People nailed their back doors shut. They sat up all night with loaded shotguns across their laps. They checked the locks 3 times. 5 times before they went to bed. Families who had lived peacefully for decades in the same neighborhoods suddenly looked at their neighbors with suspicion. Italian grocers, who formed the backbone of so many New Orleans communities, began to wonder if someone was hunting them, because the Axeman seemed to have a type. His victims were almost always Italian. They almost always ran small grocery stores. They almost always lived in the apartments behind or above those stores. And the Axeman almost always came through the same way. He would find a panel in the back door of the house. He would use a chisel to carefully, quietly remove that panel. He would crawl through the opening, and then he would find the axe. Because here is the detail that makes the Axeman case so uniquely disturbing. He almost never brought his own weapon. He used theirs. He would search the house or the yard or the shed until he found the family's own axe. And then he would carry it to the bedroom where the family lay sleeping. And he would begin to swing. This is not a case with a neat ending. There is no moment where the detective slaps the handcuffs on the killer, and the city breathes a sigh of relief. The Axeman of New Orleans is one of the great unsolved mysteries in American criminal history. It is a case that has haunted researchers and true crime enthusiasts for more than a century. And tonight, we are going to walk through every single attack, every clue, every suspect, every dead end, and every theory. We are going to try to understand not just what happened in New Orleans in 1918 and 1919, but what it felt like to live through it. What it felt like to go to bed every night knowing that somewhere out there in the humid darkness, a man with an axe was looking for his next victim, and that the police, for all their effort, could not seem to stop him. To understand the Axeman, you first have to understand the New Orleans he moved through. In 1918, the city was a very different place than it is today, and yet in many ways it was exactly the same. The French Quarter was already old. The Garden District was already beautiful. The cemeteries were already above ground, their whitewashed tombs gleaming in the sun like small marble cities. The port was one of the busiest in the country, and the river was the lifeblood of everything. Ships came and went constantly, carrying cotton and sugar and coffee and timber. The docks were loud and chaotic and full of men from every corner of the world. Sailors and dockworkers and merchants speaking a dozen different languages. New Orleans in 1918 was a city of immigrants. It had always been a city of immigrants. The French had come first, then the Spanish, then the Africans, both enslaved and free, then the Irish, the Germans, the Sicilians, the Croatians. Each group had carved out its own space in the city. Each group had brought its own food, its own music, its own traditions, its own way of doing business. And among the most successful of these immigrant communities were the Italians. The Italian community in New Orleans was large and deeply rooted. Most of the Italian families in the city had come from Sicily, and they had come in waves beginning in the late 1800s. They had come looking for the same thing every immigrant looks for: a better life. A chance to work hard and build something for their children, and many of them had found exactly that. The path to success for a Sicilian immigrant in New Orleans very often ran through the grocery business. A family would save enough money to open a small corner grocery store. The store would serve the neighborhood. It would sell bread and cheese and olive oil and canned goods and fresh vegetables. The family would live in the back of the store or in the apartment above it. The husband would run the counter. The wife would keep the books. The children would help stock the shelves after school. It was a simple, hard-working life. And by 1918, there were Italian-owned grocery stores on almost every block in certain parts of New Orleans. They were the anchor of their communities. The place where neighbors gathered to gossip and catch up. The place where you could buy a loaf of bread on credit if money was tight. The place where the old men sat outside on wooden chairs in the evening and smoked their cigars and told stories about the old country. These were the people the Axeman chose to attack. Quiet, hard-working, family-oriented people who had done nothing to anyone. People who left their doors unlocked because they lived in neighborhoods where everyone knew everyone else. People who had no enemies, no debts, no dark secrets. Just families, just people trying to live. Now, most accounts of the Axeman case begin in 1918. That is when the attacks became frequent and when the newspapers began to pay attention. But there is evidence that the Axeman, or someone very much like him, may have been active years earlier. In 1911, there were a series of attacks on Italian grocers in New Orleans that bear a striking resemblance to the later Axeman crimes. The victims were similar. The weapon was similar, and the attacks were never solved. Whether these earlier crimes were committed by the same person who terrorized the city in 1919 is a question we will explore later. But for now, it is important to know that the shadow of the Axeman may stretch back further than most people realize. The evil that descended on New Orleans did not arrive suddenly. It may have been building for years, testing, practicing, learning what worked and what did not. And when it finally emerged in full force, it was practiced and efficient and terrifyingly effective. The first attack that is widely attributed to the Axeman and his more famous period of activity occurred on the night of May 20, 1910. The victims were Joseph and Catherine Maggio. Joseph was an Italian immigrant. He was a barber by trade, but like so many Italians in New Orleans, his family also ran a grocery store. The store was located at the corner of Upper Line and Magnolia Streets. Joseph and Catherine lived in the apartment behind the store. Joseph's brothers, Andrew and Jake, lived in an apartment next door. It was a close family. They saw each other every day. They ate meals together. They worked together. They looked out for the way immigrant families do in a new country. There was nothing unusual about the night of May 22nd. Joseph and Catherine had dinner. They closed the store. They locked the door to bed. The neighborhood was quiet. The streets were empty. The only sounds were the usual sounds of a New Orleans night: insects, a distant dog barking, the occasional clatter of a streetcar somewhere far away. The air was warm and thick with humidity. It was the kind of night where you sleep with the windows open and hope for a breeze that never comes. Sometime in the early hours of May 23rd, Andrew Maggio woke up. Something had pulled him out of sleep. He was not sure what it was at first. A sound, maybe. Something that did not belong in the quiet of the night. He lay there in the dark, listening. And then he heard it again. A groan, low and guttural and full of pain. It was coming from next door, from Joseph and Catherine's apartment. Andrew got up. He woke Jake. The two brothers moved quickly to the apartment next door. The back door was open. Not just unlocked, open. And as they stepped inside, the smell hit them first. Blood has a smell. It is metallic and thick, and once you have smelled it, you never forget it. The apartment was dark. Andrew called out for his brother, for Catherine. There was no answer, just another groan. Weak now. Fading, they found them in the bedroom. Catherine Maggio was lying on the bed. Her skull had been split open. The wound was so severe that brain matter was visible. She was still breathing, but barely. The breath came in short, wet gasps that sounded nothing like normal breathing. It sounded like someone drowning on dry land. Joseph was on the floor beside the bed. His head was a ruin. He had been struck multiple times with something heavy and sharp. His throat had also been cut. Not a quick slash, but a deep, deliberate wound that had nearly severed the arteries on both sides of his neck. The blood was everywhere. On the walls. On the sheets that had been white just hours ago. The room looked like something from a nightmare. Andrew Maggio stumbled out of the apartment and into the street. He was screaming. He was covered in his brother's blood. He ran to the nearest place he could think of. A bar on the corner. He pounded on the door and begged the owner to call the police. The bar owner took one look at Andrew's face, at the blood on his hands and his shirt, and picked up the phone. The police arrived quickly. This was not a city where violent crime was unusual. New Orleans in 1918 had its share of murders and assaults and robberies. The police were accustomed to blood. But even by the standards of a city that had seen a lot of violence, what they found in the Maggio apartment was shocking. Catherine was still alive when the first officers arrived, but she died before she could be taken to a hospital. She never regained consciousness. She never said a word. Joseph was also still alive, but just barely. He died a short time later. Neither of them was ever able to tell the police what had happened. Neither of them ever identified their attacker. They simply lay there in their own blood and slipped away. The police examined the apartment. They found the weapon almost immediately. It was a straight razor. It was lying on the floor near the bodies, covered in blood. But the razor was not what had caused the massive head wounds. Those wounds had been inflicted by something much heavier. The officers searched the property and found an axe. It was the Maggio's own axe. It had been kept in the backyard near the woodpile. Someone had taken it and used it to batter Joseph and Catherine as they slept. Then, for reasons no one has ever been able to explain, the killer had also used a razor to cut their throats. It was excessive. It was brutal beyond what was necessary. And it was deeply personal. The police also found something else. The back door of the apartment had been breached. A panel in the lower portion of the door had been chiseled out. The chisel was found on the ground nearby. It too belonged to the Maggios. The killer had not come prepared with his own tools. He had used whatever he found at the scene. The chiseled panel in the door was just large enough for a person to crawl through. It would have been a tight fit. The killer would have had to get down on his hands and knees and squeeze through the opening. But it could be done, and it had been done. This was not a crime of opportunity. This was planned. Someone had come to the Maggio home in the middle of the night with the specific intention of getting inside. They had brought nothing with them, which meant they either knew the tools would be there or they were willing to improvise. Either way, this was someone who had done this kind of thing before, or at the very least had thought about it in great detail. Detectives began canvassing the neighborhood immediately. They knocked on doors up and down Upper Line Street and Magnolia Street. They asked if anyone had seen anything, if anyone had heard anything. The results were frustrating. In a neighborhood this dense, with houses this close together, someone should have heard something. An axe striking a human skull makes a sound. A woman screaming makes a sound. But the night had been quiet, or at least that is what the neighbors said. Some of them may have heard something and dismissed it. A thump in the night, a muffled cry. In a city where sounding strangely through the warm air, where the walls are thin and the houses are old, people learn to ignore the sounds that do not belong to them. But one detail did emerge from the canvassing. Several people in the neighborhood reported seeing a man behaving strangely near the Maggio grocery earlier that evening. The descriptions were vague. A dark figure. A man who seemed to be watching the store. A shape that moved along the side of the building and then disappeared into the shadows. No one could provide a detailed description. No one could say for certain what the man had looked like or what he had been doing. He was just a presence, a feeling. The sense that someone was out there in the darkness who should not have been. The police investigation moved quickly in those first few hours, but it also moved in a direction that would prove to be a mistake. Suspicion almost immediately fell on Andrew Maggio himself. This was not entirely unreasonable. Andrew had been the one to find the bodies. He had been covered in blood. He lived right next door. And there is a well-known principle in criminal investigation that the person who reports the crime is often the person who committed the crime. Andrew was questioned intensely. His story was examined from every angle. Where had he been that night? What had he heard? Why had he waited so long to check on his brother? Had there been any problems between him and Joseph? Any arguments? Any financial disputes? Andrew every question. He was cooperative. He was devastated. He told the detectives that he had heard the sounds and had gone to investigate immediately. He had not waited. He had not hesitated. He had found his brother and his sister-in-law dying in their bed, and he had run for help. That was all. There was nothing more to tell. The police also looked at Andrew's razor. Andrew was a barber just like Joseph. He owned razors. The razor found at the scene could have been his. But it could also have been Joseph's. Or it could have belonged to someone else entirely. The truth was that straight razors were incredibly common in 1918. Nearly every man in New Orleans owned one. Finding a razor at a crime scene in 1918 was like finding a cell phone at a crime scene today. It told you very little. The police held Andrew for questioning for some time, but ultimately they had no evidence to connect him to the murders. No motive. No witnesses who had seen him leave his apartment and enter his brother's. No blood on his own clothing that could not be explained by his discovery of the bodies. They released him. And with Andrew eliminated as a suspect, the police were left with nothing. No motive. No suspect. No clear explanation for why someone would break into the home of a quiet Italian barber and his wife and beat them to death with their own axe. There was one more detail from the Maggio crime scene that would not be understood for some time. Someone had written something on a sidewalk near the Maggio grocery. It was written in chalk. The message read, "Mrs. Joseph Maggio is going to sit up tonight just like Mrs. Tunney." The meaning of this message was unclear. Who was Mrs. Tunney? Why was she being referenced? The police investigated and found that a woman named Toni Sciambra had been attacked in a similar manner some years earlier. The connection was disturbing. It suggested that whoever had killed the Maggios was aware of previous attacks. That this was not an isolated incident. That there was a pattern. But the police in 1918 were not equipped to think in terms of serial offenders. The concept of a serial killer, as we understand it today, did not exist in the popular consciousness. The idea that one person might be systematically hunting and killing members of a specific community was almost unthinkable. And so the chalk message was noted but not fully pursued. It was filed away as just another strange detail in a case that was full of strange details. The city moved on. The newspapers covered the Maggio murders for a few days and then turned their attention to other things. The war in Europe, the Spanish flu, which was beginning to make its terrifying advance across the country. Political scandals, sports scores. The murder of an Italian grocer and his wife, while tragic, was not the kind of story that held the front page for long. Not in 1918, not in New Orleans. The city had too many other problems to worry about. And the police, who were understaffed and underfunded and dealing with a dozen other cases at any given time, quietly moved the Maggio file to the side. It was unsolved. It would remain unsolved. And unless something new came to light, there was not much more they could do. But something new did come to light. Less than a month later, on the night of June 27, 1918, a man named Louis Besumer was attacked in his home. Besumer was a grocer. He was Polish, not Italian, though many in the neighborhood believed him to be Italian. He lived with a woman named Harriet Lowe. They were not married, though they presented themselves as husband and wife. Their relationship was complicated, and it would become even more complicated as the investigation unfolded. But on the night of June 27th, all of that was in the future. On that night, Besumer and Lowe were asleep in the apartment behind Besumer's grocery store on the corner of Dorgenois and La Harpe streets. Sometime in the early morning hours, someone chiseled out a panel in the back door of the apartment. Someone crawled through the opening. Someone found an axe. And someone attacked. A baker named John Zanka discovered the aftermath the next morning. Zanka came to the store early to make a delivery. He knocked on the door. There was no answer. He tried the door and found it open. He walked inside and found Bazoomer standing in the hallway. Bazoomer was dazed. Blood was running down his face from a wound on his head. He seemed confused, as if he did not fully understand what had happened to him. He told Zanka that he had been attacked, that someone had hit him while he was sleeping. Zanka called the police. When the officers arrived, they found Harriet Lowe in the bedroom. She had been struck in the head with an axe. The wound was devastating. A section of her skull had been crushed inward. She was unconscious and barely alive. She was rushed to Charity Hospital, where doctors performed emergency surgery. Against all odds, she survived. But her recovery was long and painful and incomplete. The similarities to the Maggio case were immediately obvious. An Italian or perceived Italian grocer. An apartment behind a store, a chiseled panel in the back door. An axe belonging to the victim used as the weapon. The pattern was undeniable. And now, for the first time, the newspapers began to wonder if these attacks were connected. If there was someone out there specifically targeting grocers. The word Axeman began to appear in headlines. Not yet as a formal name, but as a description. The axe-wielding attack. The man with the axe. The grocery store stalker. The language was still searching for the right term. But the concept was taking shape. New Orleans was beginning to understand that it had a problem that was not going to go away on its own. The Bazoomer case, however, quickly became complicated in ways the Maggio case had not. When Harriet Lowe regained consciousness several days after the attack, she told the police something unexpected. She said that Bazoomer had attacked her, that he had been the one who struck her with the axe. She said that Bazoomer was a German spy, that he kept letters written in German in his apartment, that he was working against the United States. Remember, this was 1918. The country was at war with Germany. Accusations of espionage were taken seriously. The police searched Bazoomer's apartment and did find letters written in what they initially believed to be German, though they later turned out to be in Russian and Yiddish. Bazoomer was arrested. He was charged with assault. The newspapers, which had been building the Axeman narrative, suddenly had to contend with the possibility that at least one of the attacks was a domestic dispute rather than the work of a serial killer. The story became muddled. The clean narrative of a mysterious figure stalking the streets of New Orleans was disrupted by the messy reality of human relationships. But the attacks did not stop, and the doubts raised by the Bazoomer case would soon be overwhelmed by the sheer weight of what came next. On the very same day that Bazoomer was attacked, June 28, 1918, another victim was found. This attack had occurred in a different part of the city, but the method was identical. The victim was a pregnant woman named Anna Schneider. Actually, her married name was Mrs. Edward Schneider. She was found by her husband when he came home from work. Anna was lying on her bed unconscious, her face covered in blood. She had been struck multiple times with a heavy, sharp object. Several of her teeth had been knocked out. Her skull was fractured. She was 8 months pregnant. Edward Schneider was frantic. He called for help immediately. Anna was taken to the hospital, where she hovered between life and death for days. Miraculously, she survived. Even more miraculously, she gave birth to a healthy baby girl a few weeks later. But Anna could not remember anything about the attack. She could not describe her assailant. She could not say how he had gotten in, or what he had looked like, or what he had said. The only thing she could say with certainty was that she had been alone in the apartment, and that she had woken up to a dark figure standing over her. And then there was pain. And then there was nothing. The police found the now familiar evidence at the Schneider home. A panel in the back door had been chiseled out. An axe had been found nearby. The pattern was holding. And with 3 attacks in just over a month, all following the same method, the police could no longer avoid the conclusion that they had a serial offender on their hands. The newspapers had already arrived at this conclusion. The Axeman of New Orleans was now a defined entity in the public imagination. He had a method, he had a type of victim. He had a way of getting in, and he was still out there. The city was afraid. On August 5, 1918, the terror escalated again. Joseph Romano was a barber. He was elderly. He lived with his 2 nieces, Pauline and Mary Bruno, in a house on Tonti Street. The apartment was, once again connected to a grocery store. At around 3 in the morning, Pauline Bruno woke to a sound in the hallway. She opened her eyes and saw a figure standing there. A tall, dark shape. The figure was holding something. It took her a moment to understand what she was seeing. And then the figure moved past her and into the room where her uncle was sleeping. Pauline screamed. She woke Mary. The two women ran into their uncle's room and found him sitting on the edge of his bed. Blood was pouring from his head. He had been struck with an axe. The blade had cracked his skull. Joseph Romano looked at his nieces and said, in a voice that was barely a whisper, that someone had hit him. That a man had come into his room and hit him with an axe. And then Joseph Romano collapsed. He was taken to Charity Hospital. He died 2 days later. He never identified his attacker beyond the vague description of a dark figure. Pauline and Mary told the police what they had seen. A tall, heavy-set man, dark clothing, a hat pulled low over his face. He had moved quickly and silently. He had not spoken. He had simply entered the room, swung the axe, and left. The back door of a house bore the familiar evidence. A panel chiseled out. The chisel left on the ground. The axe found in the yard. The axeman had struck again, and this time, Kitty was in a state of near panic. 4 attacks in less than 3 months. 2 people dead, several others badly injured, and the police had no suspects, no leads, no idea who was doing this or why. The newspapers published sensational stories about the axeman. They speculated about his identity. They published theories from so-called experts. Some said the axeman was a lunatic, a madman driven by some incomprehensible compulsion. Others said he was a mafia enforcer, targeting Italian grocers who had refused to pay protection money. Still others said he was a supernatural entity, a demon or a ghost who could pass through walls and vanish into the night. The theories ranged from the plausible to the absurd, but they all shared one thing in common. They all reflected the city's desperate need to understand what was happening, to put a name and a face and a reason on the horror that was visiting their homes in the dead of night. Italian grocers across New Orleans began taking precautions. Some of them hired private guards to watch their stores at night. Others began sleeping with loaded weapons beside their beds. Some families abandoned their homes entirely and moved in with relatives in other parts of the city. The grocery stores, which had always been the heart of their neighborhoods, became places of fear. The axeman had not just attacked individuals, he had attacked a way of life. He had poisoned the sense of safety and community that the Italian grocers had worked so hard to build. And the worst part was that no one knew when or where he would strike next. He could be anyone. He could be anywhere. He could be the man standing on the corner watching the store. He could be the stranger who came in to buy a loaf of bread and lingered a little too long. He could be the shadow that moved across the yard at midnight. The axeman was invisible, and that made him more terrifying than any monster with a face. The police commissioner, Frank Mooney, was under enormous pressures. The newspapers wanted answers. The Italian community wanted answers. Mooney assigned his best detectives to the case. He requested additional resources from the state. He appealed to the public for information. But the truth was that the New Orleans Police Department in 1918 was not well equipped to handle a case like this. Forensic science was in its infancy. There was no DNA testing. There was no computerized database of criminals. There were no security cameras. The tools available to detectives in 1910 were essentially the same tools that had been available to detectives in 1818. Shoe leather, interviews, informants. And against the axeman, none of these tools seemed to be working. The killer left almost no evidence at his crime scenes. He wore gloves or somehow avoided leaving fingerprints. He came and went without being seen. He left no personal items behind. The axes and chisels he used all belonged to his victims. There was nothing to trace, nothing to follow, nothing to work with. It was as if the axeman materialized out of the darkness, committed his atrocity, and then dissolved back into the night. And then, just as suddenly as the attacks had begun, they stopped. After the Romano attack in August of 1918, there was a pause. Weeks went by, then months. September passed without attack. October, November, December. The city held its breath. Was it over? Had the axeman left New Orleans? Had he died? Had he been arrested for some other crime and locked away without anyone realizing who he truly was? The newspapers speculated. The police continued to investigate. But there were no new attacks, no new victims, no new chiseled panels and back doors. The Axeman, it seemed, had gone quiet. But the people of New Orleans were not fooled. They had lived through enough hurricanes to know that the calm before the storm is not a comfort. It is a warning. And deep down, in a place they did not like to examine too closely, they knew the Axeman was not gone. He was waiting. And when he came back, it would be worse than before. They were right. The silence lasted for months. Through the fall of 1918, the city of New Orleans tried to return to something resembling normal life. The war in Europe was grinding toward its conclusion. The Spanish flu was ravaging the country, killing thousands, filling hospitals to overflowing, turning everyday interactions into acts of fear. People had other things to worry about. The Axeman, while not forgotten, had been pushed to the back of the collective mind by the sheer weight of everything else that was happening. The newspapers still mentioned the case from time to time, but the stories had moved from the front page to the inside columns. There were no new developments to report, no new attacks, no breakthroughs. The investigation had stalled, and in the way of all stalled investigations, it had begun to fade from public attention. But for the Italian community in New Orleans, the fear never faded. It sat in their homes like an unwelcome guest. It was there when they locked the doors at night. It was there when they heard a sound outside the window. It was there when they looked at the back door and wondered if the panels were strong enough. The grocers, in particular, lived in a state of constant vigilance. Some of them had reinforced their doors with extra wood and iron bars. Some had installed new locks. Some had moved their beds away from the walls so that they would have more time to react if someone came through the door. These were practical measures, sensible measures, the kind of things you do when you know that the police cannot protect you, and that the only person standing between your family and the darkness is you. But practical measures only go so far when the enemy is invisible, when you do not know who he is or when he will come or why he has chosen you. The Italian grocers of New Orleans were living under siege, and the worst part was that they could not see the army surrounding them. Meanwhile, the police were quietly pursuing several lines of investigation that would lead nowhere. The Bezumer case had become hopelessly tangled. Louis Bezumer was still under suspicion for the attack on Harriet Lowe. Lowe herself had made multiple contradictory statements. She had initially accused Bezumer of attacking her. Then she had recanted. Then she had accused him again. The police did not know what to believe. Bezumer maintained his innocence. He said that both he and Lowe had been attacked by an intruder, that the panel in the back door proved that someone had broken in, that the axe had been wielded by a stranger, not by him. The police were torn. On the one hand, Lowe's accusations were troubling. On the other hand, the method of the attack was identical to the Maggio and Romano cases. If Bezumer was the attacker in his own case, then who had attacked the Maggios and Romano? Were there two attackers? One serial offender and one domestic abuser, both using the same method? It seemed unlikely. But the alternative, that the Axeman had attacked Bezumer and Lowe just as he had attacked the others, meant that Lowe was lying about Bezumer. And if she was lying, why? The Bezumer case would drag on for years. Bezumer would eventually stand trial for the murder of Harriet Lowe, who died in August of 1919 from complications related to her injuries. He would be acquitted. The jury would conclude that the evidence against him was insufficient, and that the more likely explanation was that both Bezumer and Lowe had been victims of the Axeman. But that verdict was still in the future. In the fall of 1918, all the police knew was that they had a mess on their hands and no clear way to untangle it. They also pursued the mafia theory. This was the most popular theory among the general public and among many in the police department itself. The idea was straightforward. The Italian grocers were being targeted by the mafia, specifically by the Black Hand, a loose network of Italian criminals who extorted money from fellow immigrants through threats of violence. The Black Hand had been active in New Orleans for decades. Their method was simple. They would send a letter to an Italian businessman demanding payment. The letter would be signed with a crewing of a black hand. If the businessman paid, he was left alone. If he did not pay, bad things happened. His store might be vandalized. His family might be threatened. In extreme cases, he might be attacked or killed. The Black Hand was a real and genuine threat to the Italian community, and many of the grocers who had been attacked by Axeman had reportedly received Black Hand letters in the past. It was not a stretch to imagine that the Axeman attacks were simply an escalation of Black Hand violence, a more extreme form of the same extortion that had plagued the Italian community for years. The theory had a certain elegant simplicity. It explained why the victims were Italian. It explained why they were grocers, since grocers were visible, accessible targets with cash on hand. It explained why the attacks were so brutal, since the Black Hand relied on terror to maintain its power. And it explained why the police could not catch the attacker, since the Black Hand operated within a closed community where the code of silence, the omerta, was deeply ingrained. Victims of Black Hand extortion rarely went to the police. They were afraid of retaliation. They were afraid that the police, who were predominantly Irish and American in 1918, would not understand or care about the problems of Italian immigrants. And in many cases they were right. The police did not always take the complaints of Italian immigrants seriously. There was a pervasive attitude in the department that Italian crime was an internal matter, a cultural problem that the Italian community should solve on its own. This attitude was rooted in prejudice, and it had real consequences. It meant that crimes against Italian immigrants were investigated less thoroughly, less urgently, and less competently than crimes against other citizens. And it meant that the Italian community, the very community most at risk from the Axeman, had the least reason to trust the people who were supposed to protect them. But the mafia theory had problems. Serious problems. For one thing, not all of the victims had received Black Hand letters. Some of them had no known connection to the mafia at all. For another, the method of the attacks did not match typical Black Hand violence. The Black Hand usually used bombs or guns. They were not known for breaking into homes in the middle of the night and attacking people with axes. The Axeman's method was intimate, personal, almost ritualistic. He came in through the back door. He used the victim's own tools. He attacked while they slept. This was not the behavior of a professional criminal carrying out an extortion-related punishment. This was something else. Something stranger and darker and more difficult to explain. The mafia theory was comforting in a way, because it suggested that the attacks were rational, that they were motivated by money, that they could be prevented by simply paying the demanded sum. But the truth was probably more disturbing. The Axeman's attacks did not look rational. They looked obsessive, compulsive. The work of someone driven by an urge that had nothing to do with money. There was also the question of the non-Italian victims. Anna Schneider was German, not Italian. Luz Bezumer was Polish. If the Axeman was a mafia enforcer targeting Italians who refused to pay protection money, why was he attacking non-Italians? The defenders of the mafia theory argued that Bezumer and Schneider lived in Italian neighborhoods and might have been mistaken for Italians, or that the attacks on non-Italians were copycat crimes, carried out by someone who had been inspired by the Axeman but was not actually the Axeman himself. These explanations were possible but not convincing. They required too many assumptions, too many exceptions, too many coincidences. The mafia theory was a comfortable explanation, but it did not fit the facts as well as its proponents wanted to believe. The months passed. Fall turned to winter, winter turned to spring, and on the night of March 10, 1919, the Axeman returned. The victims were Charles and Rosie Cordia. They were Italian. They ran a grocery store. They lived in the apartment behind the store. The store was located in the town of Gretna, just across the river from New Orleans. Gretna was a small, close community. Everyone knew everyone. The Cordamiglias were well liked. They had a 2-year-old daughter named Mary. She was their pride and joy, a beautiful toddler with dark curly hair and bright eyes. On the night of March 10th, Charles and Rosie and little Mary went to bed early. There was nothing unusual about the evening. Nothing that gave any indication of what was coming. The house was locked. The store was closed. The family was safe. Or so they believed. Sometime after midnight, the Axeman came. The method was the same as always. A panel in the back door was chiseled out. The chisel was left on the ground. The Axeman crawled through the opening and into the dark house. He found an axe, and he went to the bedroom where the Cordiglia family lay sleeping. Charles Cortimiglia was struck first. The axe came down on his head with tremendous force, fracturing his skull. Rosie was struck next. She too suffered devastating head wounds, but the worst was yet to come. As Rosie lay on the bed, bleeding and barely conscious, she was still holding little Mary in her arms. The axeman swung the axe again. The blade struck the child. 2-year-old Mary Cortimiglia was killed. She died in her mother's arms. This was the attack that broke the city. The murder of a child. There is something about the killing of a child that crosses a line that other murders do not cross. Adults can be rationalized. Adults have enemies, debts, secrets. There is always some framework, however flimsy, that allows the human mind to process the murder of an adult. But a child has none of that. A child is purely innocent. A child has no enemies. A child has done nothing to anyone. The murder of 2-year-old Mary Cortimiglia was an act of pure evil, and the people of New Orleans knew it. The newspapers erupted. The headlines screamed. The public demanded action. How could this happen? How could the police allow this to continue? How many more people had to die before someone caught this monster? Charles Cortimiglia survived his injuries, though he would never fully recover. Rosie also survived, but she was shattered in ways that went far beyond her physical wounds. She had been holding her daughter when the axe fell. She had felt the impact. She had felt her child go limp in her arms. That is not something a person recovers from. That is not something that heals with time or therapy or prayer. That is a wound that goes all the way down to the bedrock of the soul and stays there forever. When Rosie was well enough to speak to the police, she made a statement that would throw the entire investigation into chaos. She said she knew who had attacked her family. She said it was her neighbor, Orlando Giordano, and his son Frank. The Giordanos were Italian. They also ran a grocery store just across the street from the Cortimiglias. Rosie said that she had seen them clearly, that they had been the ones who came through the door, that they had been the ones who swung the axe. The police arrested Orlando and Frank Giordano immediately. The Giordano arrest was a sensation. Finally, it seemed the axeman had been caught, or at least 2 of his accomplices had been caught. The newspapers covered the arrest with breathless excitement. But from the very beginning, there were problems with Rosie Cortimiglia's accusation. Serious problems. For one thing, Orlando Giordano was 69 years old and weighed well over 200 pounds. The hole in the back door of the Cortimiglia home was barely large enough for a small, agile person to crawl through. The idea that a 69-year-old, overweight man had squeezed through that hole, found an axe, and used it to attack 3 people was difficult to accept. Frank Giordano was younger and more physically capable, but there was no evidence linking him to the crime. No blood on his clothing, no witnesses who had seen him near the Cortimiglia home, no motive. The Giordanos and the Cortimiglias were neighbors. They had no known disputes. They had no reason to harm each other. The accusation seemed to come from nowhere. Charles Cortimiglia contradicted his wife's account. He said he did not know who had attacked them. He said the room had been too dark to see anything. He said he had not recognized the attacker. He specifically said that the Giordanos had not been involved. This was extraordinary. A husband and wife both present during the same attack, giving completely opposite accounts. One said the Giordanos did it, the other said they did not. The police chose to believe Rosie, or perhaps more accurately, the police chose to follow the lead that gave them a suspect, any suspect, because the pressure to make an arrest was overwhelming. The Giordanos were charged with murder. They would stand trial, and the trial would become one of the most controversial events in New Orleans legal history. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because while the Cortimiglia case was unfolding, something else happened. Something that elevated the Axeman from a local terror to a figure of national legend. Something that made him not just a killer, but a character, a personality, an entity with a voice. On March 13, 1919, just 3 days after the Cortimiglia attack, the New Orleans Times-Picayune published a letter. The letter was purportedly written by the Axeman himself. It had been delivered to the newspaper's office. No one knew who had brought it. No one had seen it arrive. It was simply there one morning, waiting to be opened, and when the editors read it, they knew they had something extraordinary on their hands. The letter was written in a florid, dramatic style that was part performance, part dark comedy. It was addressed to the people of New Orleans, and it read, in part, something to the effect of the following. The writer identified himself as a spirit, a demon, a being from the hottest depths of hell. He said he was not human. He said he had been sent to New Orleans by a power beyond human understanding. He said he could be killed by no earthly means. Bullets could not harm him. Walls could not stop him. Locks were meaningless to him. He would come and go as he pleased, and no one could prevent him from carrying out his mission. But then the letter took an unexpected turn. The writer said that he loved jazz. He said that jazz was the one thing in the earthly world that gave him pleasure, and he made a promise. On the next Tuesday night, which would be March 19th, 1919, he would pass through the city of New Orleans. He would visit every home, and any home where a jazz band was playing would be spared. But any home where no jazz was playing, where the occupants were not honoring the music that he loved, would receive a visit from the Axeman and his axe. The letter was sensational. It was outrageous. It was terrifying and absurd in equal measure. It read like something written by a madman, but a madman with a flair for the dramatic. A madman who wanted attention. A madman who enjoyed the power he held over the city and wanted to demonstrate that power in the most theatrical way possible. The newspapers published the letter in full. It was read aloud on street corners. It was discussed in bars and barbershops and grocery stores. It was the only thing anyone in New Orleans could talk about, and it created an extraordinary situation. The people of New Orleans had been given a choice by their tormentor. Play jazz and live. Stay silent and die. What happened next is one of the most remarkable episodes in the history of any American city. On the night of Tuesday, March 1919, the entire city of New Orleans threw a party. Every dance hall was packed. Every bar was blasting music. People hired bands to play in their living rooms. Families who could not afford to hire musicians cranked up their phonographs as loud as they would go. The streets were filled with the sound of trumpets and trombones and clarinets and drums. People danced on their porches. They danced in their yards. They danced in the streets. It was like a Mardi Gras celebration in the middle of March, but with an undercurrent of desperation that Mardi Gras never had. Because this was not just a party. This was an act of defiance. This was an entire city saying to its tormentor, "We are not afraid of you." Or perhaps more honestly, we are afraid of you, but we will not let that fear silence us. We will play our music. We will dance our dances. We will live our lives. And if you come for us, you will find us on our feet, not cowering in our beds. A local composer named Joseph John de Villa even wrote a song for the occasion. It was a novelty tune, a jazzy, upbeat number that mocked the Axeman and dared him to do his worst. The song was performed all over the city that night. It was a hit. It captured the spirit of the evening perfectly. That unique New Orleans combination of humor and bravery and fatalism that has always defined the city's character. When New Orleans is threatened, it does not hide. It throws a party. It plays music. It laughs in the face of death. And on the night of March 19th, 1919, that is exactly what it did. And the Axeman did not strike that night. Whether this was because of the music, or because the killer had planned all along to stay quiet that night, or because the sheer number of people awake and alert in the city made it too risky to attack, no one knows. But the letter had achieved its purpose. It had demonstrated the Axeman's power over the city. He had given a command and the city had obeyed. Even if the obedience was disguised as defiance. Even if the people of New Orleans framed their compliance as rebellion, the fact remained that the Axeman had told them to play jazz and they had played jazz. He had pulled the strings, and the city had danced. It was a breathtaking display of psychological control, and it cemented the Axeman's place in the mythology of New Orleans forever. But the question of who wrote the letter remains one of the great mysteries of the case. Was it really written by the Axeman, or was it a hoax? Someone playing a prank? A journalist looking for a story? A attention seeker who had nothing to do with the murders but wanted to ride the wave of fear. There are arguments on both sides. The letter was articulate and well written, which some investigators took as evidence that it was written by someone educated, someone who read books and newspapers, and had a command of language that was unusual for the average criminal of that era. Others pointed out that the letter's dramatic style was inconsistent with the clinical, methodical nature of the actual attacks. The Axeman's crimes were brutal but efficient. There was no showmanship at the crime scenes, no taunting messages left behind, aside from the mysterious chalk writing near the Maggio home. The letter seemed to come from a different personality entirely, a performer, a narcissist, someone who craved attention and admiration. The actual Axeman, as revealed by his crimes, seemed to be someone who craved anonymity and silence. There is no way to know for certain whether the letter was genuine. The police investigated its origins, but were unable to determine who had written it, or how it had been delivered to the newspaper. It remains one of the most fascinating artifacts of the case, a piece of theater that transformed a serial killer into a folk figure. A letter that turned a series of brutal murders into a story with a plot, a character, and a voice. Whether the Axeman actually wrote it or not, the letter gave the case a narrative dimension that it had previously lacked. Before the letter, the Axeman was just a shadow. After the letter, he was a character in a story that the entire city was living through. In the weeks and months following the jazz night, the attacks continued, but they began to change in subtle ways that are worth noting. The intervals between attacks became irregular. The locations shifted. The severity varied. Some attacks were vicious and nearly fatal. Others were surprisingly mild, as if the Axeman had been interrupted or had lost his nerve. The pattern, which had seemed so clear in the earlier attacks, began to fracture, and this fracturing raised new questions. Was the Axeman still the same person? Were there copycats? Was the original Axeman losing control? Or was the pattern an illusion to begin with, a narrative imposed on a series of events that were actually more random and disconnected than anyone wanted to believe? On August 10, 1919, another attack. The victim was Steve Bocca. He was an Italian grocer. He lived on Elysian Fields Avenue. The method was the same. Chiseled panel, axe. Attack while the victim slept. Bocca was struck in the head but survived. He stumbled out of his apartment and made it to the home of a friend, Frank Janusa, before collapsing. He was taken to Charity Hospital where he recovered. But like so many of the Axeman's surviving victims, he could remember nothing about the attack. He had been asleep, he had been struck. He had woken up in pain and confusion. He had not seen his attacker. He could provide no description, no details, nothing that could help the police. Less than a month later, on September 3, 1919, the Axeman struck again. This time the victim was a young woman named Sarah Lahman. She was not Italian. She was not a grocer. She lived alone in a house on North Dorgenoy Street. She was found in her bed unconscious, with several of her teeth knocked out and a head wound inflicted by what appeared to be an axe. A panel in her back door had been chiseled out. The axe was found under her kitchen window. Sarah survived but could not identify her attacker. She had been asleep when the attack began and had no memory of what had happened. The Lahman attack was significant because it further undermined the theory that the Axeman was specifically targeting Italian grocers. Sarah Lahman was neither Italian nor a grocer. She was a young woman living alone. If the Axeman was a mafia enforcer carrying out extortion-related violence, why would he attack her? The answer, of course, was that he would not. The Lahman attack pointed toward a different kind of motivation. One that was not rational, not targeted, not driven by profit or revenge. One that was driven by something inside the attacker himself. An urge. A compulsion. A need that could be satisfied only by the act of breaking into a home and attacking the person inside. The victim's identity may have mattered less than the act itself. The ritual of the chisel, the crawl through the door, the search for the axe, the approach to the sleeping figure, the swing, for a mind driven by compulsion. The steps of the ritual may have been more important than the identity of the person on the receiving end. But even as the police struggled to understand the Axeman's psychology, the legal system was grinding forward on the Cortimiglia case. Orlando and Frank Giordano stood trial in May of 1919. Rosie Cortimiglia was the star witness for the prosecution. She repeated her accusation under oath. She said she had seen the Giordanos enter her home. She said she had seen them attack her husband and her daughter. She was emotional, compelling, and absolutely certain. The defense argued that Rosie's testimony was unreliable, that she had suffered a severe head injury that could have affected her memory and perception, that her husband, who had been present during the same attack, contradicted her account completely, that there was no physical evidence linking the Giordanos to the crime, that the physical evidence, particularly the small size of the hole in the door, actually exonerated Orlando Giordano, who was too large to have fit through it. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. They found Orlando Giordano guilty of assault and Frank Giordano guilty of murder. Orlando was sentenced to prison. Frank was sentenced to death. The verdict was a shock to many who had followed the case. The evidence against the Giordanos was thin at best. It rested entirely on the testimony of a woman with a head injury whose own husband said she was wrong. But the jury had spoken. The Giordanos were convicted. And for a brief moment, it seemed as though at least one chapter of the Axeman saga had been closed. It had not been closed. It had barely begun. Because Rosie Cortimiglia's story was not finished. In the months following the trial, Rosie began to unravel. She was consumed by guilt. She was haunted by what she had done. She could not sleep. She could not eat. She wandered the streets of Gretna, talking to herself, weeping, praying. The neighbors watched her with a mixture of pity and unease. Something was eating at Rosie from the inside. And on December 7, 1920, more than a year after the trial, Rosie Cortimiglia walked into the office of the New Orleans Times. Picayune made a confession. She said she had lied. She said the Giordanos had not attacked her family. She said she did not know who had attacked them. She said she had accused the Giordanos because she hated them. Because there had been a business rivalry between the two grocery stores. Because in her grief and pain and rage over the death of her daughter, she had wanted someone to blame, and the Giordanos were convenient targets. She had looked into the face of the court and lied under oath, and sent 2 innocent men to prison, one of them to death row, because she could not bear the randomness of what had happened to her. She needed it to make sense. She needed a villain. And so she had created one. The Giordanos were released. Orlando was freed from prison. Frank was taken off death row. They walked out into the sunlight as free men, their lives shattered but intact. The justice system had failed them spectacularly. They had spent months behind bars for a crime they had not committed. Convicted on the word of a woman who had been driven mad by grief and had channeled that madness into a lie that nearly cost a man his life. It was a staggering miscarriage of justice, and it left the Cortimiglia attack exactly where it had started. Unsolved. The Axeman was still out there. Or he had been. Because by the time the Giordanos were released, the attacks had stopped. The last known Axeman attack had occurred on October 27, 1919. The victim was Mike Pepitone. He was Italian. He lived on South Scott Street. The attack followed the now familiar pattern. A panel in the back door was chiseled out. An axe was used. Pepitone was struck multiple times in the head as he slept. His wife was in the next room with their children. She heard the sounds. She ran into the bedroom and saw a figure fleeing through the back of the house. She screamed. Neighbors came running, but the figure was gone, vanished into the darkness. Mike Pepitone was dead. He was the last known victim of the Axeman of New Orleans. After the Pepitone murder, the attack stopped. Completely. There were no more chiseled panels, no more midnight assaults, no more Italian grocers found bleeding in their beds. The Axeman was gone. He had disappeared as suddenly and as mysteriously as he had appeared, and he left behind nothing, no identity, no motive, no explanation, just a trail of blood and broken lives and unanswered questions. The city waited. Weeks passed, month, 2 years. The Axeman did not return. Slowly, cautiously, the people of New Orleans began to relax. The grocers took down their extra locks. The families moved back into their homes. The newspaper stopped writing about the case. Life went on, as life always does. But the Axeman was not forgotten. He could not be forgotten. He had left too deep a mark on the city's psyche. He had become part of the fabric of New Orleans, as much a part of the city's identity as jazz and Mardi Gras and the Mississippi River. He was a ghost story. A legend, a name that parents whispered to their children to make them behave. Be good, or the Axeman will come. He was the boogeyman of New Orleans. And like all boogeymen, he was most powerful in the imagination, where he could be anything, come from anywhere. But the story of the Axeman did not end with the silence. The silence in many ways was just as disturbing as the attacks themselves, because silence demands explanation. When a killer stops killing, the question is not simply what happened. The question is why. Why did he stop? What changed? Did something in his life shift? Did he move to another city? Did he die? Was he locked away for some unrelated crime, sitting in a prison cell somewhere, his true identity unknown even to the people guarding him? Or did he simply decide that he was done, that he had satisfied whatever dark hunger had driven him to pick up an axe and swing it at the heads of sleeping people? The absence of answers is its own kind of haunting. And in the case of the Axeman of New Orleans, the absence of answers has lasted for more than a century. Let us go back now and look more carefully at the details. Let us examine the evidence that was collected, the suspects who were considered, and the theories that were developed. Because while the Axeman was never caught, that does not mean there were no clues. There were clues. Some of them were obvious, some were subtle, some were contradictory, and some were so strange that they defy easy interpretation even today. With the benefit of 100 years of advances in criminal psychology and forensic science, the first thing that stands out when look at the Axeman case as a whole is the consistency of the method. Attack after attack, the approach was the same. The back door, the panel removed, the entry through the opening, the search for an axe belonging to the victim, the attack while the victim slept. This level of consistency tells us something important about the Axeman. It tells us that this was a person who had developed a method that worked and who was reluctant to deviate from it. In modern criminal profiling, this kind of behavioral consistency is called a signature. It is the part of the crime that the offender does not because he has to, but because he needs to. The practical aspects of a crime, the things a criminal does to avoid getting caught, those can change from crime to crime. A burglar might use a crowbar one time and a lockpick the next. A robber might wear a mask one time and a hat the next. These are adaptations. They show flexibility. But the signature, the ritualistic elements that serve the offender's psychological needs, those tend to remain constant. And the Axeman's signature was remarkably stable. Think about what that signature involved. He did not simply break down the door. He did not smash a window. He did not pick the lock. He chiseled out a panel. This is a slow, deliberate, labor-intensive method of entry. It requires patience. It requires a certain kind of skill. You have to work the chisel carefully, quietly, so as not to wake the people sleeping on the other side of the door. You have to remove the panel cleanly, leaving an opening large enough to crawl through. This is not something you do in a panic. This is not something you do on impulse. This is something you plan, something you practice, something you take pride in. The act of chiseling the panel was part of the ritual. It was part of what the Axeman needed to do. It was not just a means of entry, it was a ceremony, a preparation. The first step in a sequence of actions that culminated in the swing of the axe. And then there is the axe itself. The Axeman almost never brought his own weapon. He used the victim's axe. This is an extraordinary detail. Most killers who use weapons bring them to the crime scene. They choose their weapon in advance. They are comfortable with it. They know its weight and its balance and how it feels in their hands. But the Axeman arrived at each crime scene unarmed. He counted on finding a weapon once he was inside. This tells us several things. First, it tells us that the Axeman was confident. He believed he would find what he needed. In 1918, this was a reasonable assumption. Nearly every household in New Orleans had an axe. They were used for chopping firewood for a dozen everyday tasks. An axe was as common as a broom. The Axeman knew this. He knew that when he crawled through that panel in the door, there would be an axe somewhere on the property. He just had to find it. But the fact that he used the victim's own axe also tells us something about his psychology. There is an intimacy to using someone's own tool against them. It is a violation that goes beyond the physical. It takes something that belongs to the victim, something mundane and domestic and safe, and turns it into an instrument of destruction. The axe that had chopped the firewood that heated the family's home. The axe that had split the kindling for the morning stove. The axe that had trimmed the branches of the tree in the backyard. That axe, the family's axe, was now being used to end their lives. Whether the axeman was consciously aware of this symbolism is impossible to know. But it adds a layer of violation to the crowd is hard to ignore. He was not just attacking their bodies, he was corrupting their world, taking the tools of their daily life and weaponizing them. The targeting of Italian grocers is another element that demands careful analysis. As we discussed earlier, not every victim was Italian and not every victim was a grocer, but the majority were. And the consistency of this pattern suggests that it was not random. The axeman was drawn to Italian grocers for a reason. The question is what that reason was. The mafia theory, as we have discussed, offers one explanation, but there are others. Some researchers have suggested that the axeman may have had a personal grudge against a specific Italian grocer, and that the other attacks were attempts to disguise that personal motive behind a pattern of seemingly random violence. This is a known tactic among serial offenders. Kill several people so that the one you really wanted to kill gets lost in the crowd. The idea is that if you murder only your intended target, the police will focus on people who had a motive to kill that specific person. But if you murder a dozen people who seem to have been chosen at random, the police will look for a pattern and miss the personal connection entirely. This theory is intriguing but difficult to prove. It requires identifying which victim, if any, was the axeman's primary target, and the evidence does not clearly point to any single victim as being more significant than the others. Each attack was carried out with the same method and the same apparent intensity. There is no attack that stands out as being different from the others in a way that suggests a personal connection. The axeman treated all of his victims the same way. They were all targets. They were all means to the same end. Whatever that end was. Another theory suggests that the axeman's targeting of Italian grocers was driven by racial hatred. Anti-Italian sentiment was widespread in New Orleans in the early 20th century. The Sicilian immigrants who made up the bulk of the Italian community were viewed with suspicion and contempt by many native-born Americans. They were seen as clannish, secretive, and inherently criminal. The stereotype of the Italian immigrant as a mafia member was deeply ingrained in the popular imagination, and this stereotype had deadly consequences. In 1891, one of the most notorious mass lynchings in American history took place in New Orleans, when a mob broke into the parish prison and murdered 11 Italian immigrants, who had been acquitted of the murder of the police chief, David Hennessy. The lynching was supported by many of the city's most prominent citizens and was widely praised in the national press. It was a stark demonstration of the violence that anti-Italian prejudice could produce. Could the axeman have been motivated by a similar hatred? And could he have been someone who despised the Italian community and who expressed that hatred through systematic violence against its most visible members? It is possible. The timing of the attacks, coming during a period of heightened nativism and xenophobia driven by the war, lends some support to this theory. The war had intensified suspicion of immigrants in general and of immigrants from enemy or allied nations in particular. Italian immigrants, whose home country was an ally of the United States, but whose loyalty was nevertheless questioned, were caught in this web of suspicion. The axeman could have been someone who channeled the generalized anti-immigrant anxiety of the era into targeted violence against the people he saw as representatives of the immigrant threat. But this theory, like the others, has its weaknesses. If the axeman was motivated by racial hatred, why did he also attack non-Italians? And why did his attacks have such a specific, ritualistic quality? Hate crimes tend to be expressive. They are meant to send a message. They are often accompanied by slurs, graffiti symbols, or other forms of communication that make the motive clear. The axeman's attacks were silent. They were anonymous. They were carried out in the dark with no audience, no message, no declaration of purpose. The only possible communication was the letter published in the Times-Picayune, and as we have discussed, it is unclear whether the Axeman actually wrote that letter. The attacks themselves had no expressive dimension. They were purely destructive, and that suggests a motivation that was internal rather than ideological, personal rather than political, psychological rather than social. Modern criminal profilers, looking at the Axeman case from the perspective of contemporary behavioral science, tend to classify the Axeman as a serial offender driven by some form of paraphilic or compulsive motivation. The ritualistic nature of the crimes, the consistency of the method, the targeting of victims in their homes while they slept, the use of the victim's own tools. All of these elements suggest an offender who was satisfying a deep psychological need through the act of the attack itself. The crime was the point, the money. Not the revenge, not the ideology. The crime itself, in all its specific, ritualistic detail, was what the Axeman was after: the chisel, the panel, the crawl through the door, the search for the axe, the approach to the sleeping figure. Each step was a note in a dark composition that only the Axeman could hear. And the final act, the swing of the axe, was the crescendo. This does not mean that the Axeman's choice of victims was entirely random. He may have chosen Italian grocers because they were accessible and predictable. They lived in apartments connected to their stores. They kept regular hours. They were easy to observe and easy to plan around. Their back doors were often older and less secure than the doors of wealthier homes. They had axes on their property, and they lived in neighborhoods where the sounds of the night, the creaking of old houses, the barking of dogs, the distant music, provided enough ambient noise to cover the sound of a chisel working against wood. The Italian grocers were not chosen because of who they were. They were chosen because of how they lived. Their routines, their homes, their neighborhoods created the perfect conditions for the Axeman's ritual. They were the ideal stage for his performance. Now let us turn to the specific suspects who were considered over the course of the investigation. Because while the Axeman was never formally identified, there were several individuals who attracted the attention of the police and who have continued to attract the attention of researchers and amateur detectives in the decades since. The first and most obvious category of suspects is the victim's own family members. As we have seen, Andrew Maggio was initially suspected in the murder of his brother Joseph and his sister-in-law Catherine. Louis Bezumer was suspected in the attack on Harriet Lowe, and Rosie Cortimiglia accused the Giordano family, her neighbors, of the attack on her household. In each of these cases, the suspicion proved to be unfounded. Andrew Maggio was cleared. Bezumer was acquitted. The Giordanos were exonerated, but the fact that suspicion so often fell on people close to the victims is not surprising. In any murder investigation, the first people the police look at are the people closest to the victim: the spouse, the partner, the family member, the business associate. This is because most murders are committed by someone the victim knows. The stranger murder, the random killing by an unknown assailant, is actually quite rare. Most people who are murdered by people they have dinner with, argue with, sleep next to. The police in 1918 were following standard investigative procedure when they looked at the victim's inner circles. They were just looking in the wrong place. The second category of suspects is the one that has generated the most speculation over the years. These are the named individuals who have been proposed as the Axeman by various researchers, journalists, and amateur detectives. The list is long, and the evidence for each candidate is circumstantial at best. But some names come up again and again, and they are worth examining. One of the most frequently mentioned suspects is Joseph Mumford, sometimes spelled Momfer. Mumford was an Italian-American criminal with a long record of arrests and convictions. He had spent time in prison for a variety of offenses, including robbery, assault, and blackmail. He was known to have connections to the criminal underworld of New Orleans, and his criminal career had a feature that made him particularly interesting to Axeman investigators. The periods when Mumford was free, when he was not in prison, lined up suspiciously well with the periods when the Axeman was active. When Mumford was in prison, the attacks stopped. When Mumford was free, the attacks resumed. This correlation was first noted by researchers examining the timeline of the case, and has been cited as evidence that Mumford was the Axeman. But the most dramatic piece of evidence linking Mumford to the case came not from the police but from one of the victims, or rather from the wife of one of the victims. In December of 1920, a woman named Esther Albano shot and killed a man on a street in Los Angeles, California. The man she killed was Joseph Mumford. Esther Albano, it turned out, was the widow of Mike Pepitone, the last known victim of the Axeman. She had remarried and moved to Los Angeles, but she had never stopped thinking about the man who had killed her husband. And when she saw Mumford on the street in Los Angeles, she recognized him. She said he was the man she had seen fleeing her home on the night her husband was murdered. She pulled out a gun and shot him dead. Esther Albano was arrested and charged with murder. At her trial, she told the killed the man who murdered her husband. That Mumford was the Axeman of New Orleans. That she had seen his face on the night of the attack and had never forgotten it. The court was sympathetic but not convinced. Esther was convicted of murder and sentenced to prison, though she served a relatively short sentence, and the question of whether Joseph Mumford was really the Axeman remained unanswered. The case against Mumford is tantalizing but far from conclusive. The correlation between his imprisonment and the cessation of attacks is suggestive, but correlation is not causation. There were many criminals in New Orleans in 1918 and 1919 who were in and out of prison. Finding one whose imprisonment happened to overlap with the quiet periods in the Axeman case is not as meaningful as it might seem. And Esther Albano's identification of Mumford, made more than a year after the attack and under conditions of extreme emotional stress, is not the kind of eyewitness testimony that would hold up in a modern courtroom. She saw a figure fleeing her home in the dark. She was in a state of terror and shock. The figure was moving quickly. The lighting was poor. Under those conditions, the reliability of her identification is questionable at best. There is also the problem of motive. If Mumford was the Axeman, why was he attacking Italian grocers? He was Italian himself. He had no known grudge against the grocery community. His criminal record was primarily for property crimes and street-level violence, not for the kind of ritualistic, predatory behavior that characterized the Axeman attacks. Nothing in Mumford's background suggests the psychology of a serial offender. He was a criminal, yes, but he was an ordinary criminal, a thief, a con man, a bully. The Axeman was something else entirely. Still, Mumford remains the closest thing the case has to a named suspect. He is the only person who was killed specifically because someone believed he was the Axeman, and the circumstances of his death, shot on a Los Angeles street by the widow of his alleged final victim, have a poetic symmetry that makes the identification feel right, even if the evidence does not fully support it. In the world of true crime, we often want the story to have a satisfying ending. We want the killer to be identified. We want justice to be served. And the Mumford theory offers something close to that: a name, a face, a death that looks like retribution. It is a compelling narrative. But a compelling narrative is not the same as proof. Another suspect who has been proposed is Louis Bezumer himself. Despite being acquitted of the attack on Harriet Lowe, Bezumer remained a figure of suspicion throughout the case. He was an outsider. He was secretive about his background. He had been found in suspicious circumstances, and Harriet Lowe had accused him of being her attacker before she died. Some researchers have speculated that Bezumer may have staged the attack on himself and Lowe to make it look like the work of the Axeman, either to cover up a domestic assault or for some other reason. But this theory requires believing that Bezumer inflicted his own head wounds, which is difficult to accept. The injuries he sustained were real and serious. Self-inflicted axe wounds to the head are not impossible, but they are extremely unusual and extremely dangerous. It is hard to imagine someone deliberately hitting themselves in the head with an axe hard enough to cause the kind of injuries Bezumer sustained. There were also unnamed suspects, men who were seen near the crime scenes before or after the attacks, but who were never identified. The dark figure seen near the Maggio grocery. The man spotted in the neighborhood around the Cortimiglia home. The shape that Pauline Bruno saw in the hallway before her uncle was attacked. These sightings, fragmentary and unreliable as they were, paint a picture of someone who scouted his targets in advance. Someone who watched the stores and the homes and learned the routines of the people inside. Someone who knew when they went to bed and when they woke up. Someone who knew where the axes were kept and where the back doors were weakest. This was not a random attacker. This was a predator. Patient, methodical, and careful. The police in 1918 did not have the tools to catch a predator like this. They did not have forensic technology. They did not have criminal profiling. They did not have databases or communication networks that would allow them to share information quickly and efficiently. They were working with their eyes and their ears and their instincts, and against an offender who left almost no physical evidence, these tools were not enough. The detectives assigned to the case were not incompetent. They were simply outmatched. They were trying to solve a 21st century problem with 19th century methods, and the result was predictable. The case went cold, the files gathered dust, the leads dried up, and the Axeman was never caught. But there is one more theory that deserves attention. A theory that does not point to a single suspect, but rather to a type of suspect. And that is the theory that the Axeman was not one person but several. That the attacks were committed by different individuals at different times, unified not by a single mind but by a common method that had become known through newspaper coverage. In other words, the Axeman was a template, a pattern of behavior that was imitated, either consciously or unconsciously, by multiple offenders. This theory has some support in the evidence. As we have noted, the attacks varied in severity and in the details of their execution. Some were clearly the work of someone skilled and experienced. Others were clumsier, less precise, as if carried out by someone who was following a script they did not fully understand. The targeting of victims also varied. Some attacks fit the Italian grocer pattern perfectly. Others, like the attacks on Anna Schneider and Sarah Lahmann, did not fit at all. If all of the attacks were the work of one person, these variations are hard to explain. But if some of the attacks were the work of copycats, people who read about the Axeman in the newspapers and decided to imitate his method for their own purposes, then the variations make more sense. Copycat crime is a well-documented phenomenon. When a crime receives extensive media coverage, it can inspire imitation. The method becomes a template that others can follow, and in 1918 the Axeman was receiving enormous media coverage. Every attack was front-page news. The method was described in detail. The chisel, the pan and axe. Anyone who read the newspapers knew exactly how the Axeman operated. And for someone who wanted to commit a crime and blame it on the Axeman, the recipe was right there in black and white. Chisel out a panel in the back door. Find an axe. Attack. The police would assume it was the Axeman, and the real perpetrator would escape suspicion. This theory does not mean that the Axeman did not exist. It means that the Axeman may have been both a real individual and a cultural phenomenon. A single offender whose crimes were amplified and multiplied by imitators who used his method as a cover for their own violence. The core attacks, the ones that established the pattern, were probably the work of one person. But some of the later attacks, the ones that deviated from the pattern or targeted unusual victims, may have been the work of others. This would explain the inconsistencies in the case. It would explain why some attacks felt different from others. And it would explain why the police could never build a coherent profile of the offender. They were not looking at one offender. They were looking at several, layered on top of each other like transparencies on an overhead projector, creating an image that was blurry and contradictory because it was composed of multiple overlapping pictures. Whether this theory is correct is impossible to say with certainty, but it is, in many ways, the most satisfying explanation for the totality of the evidence. It accounts for the consistencies and the inconsistencies. It explains why the attacks started and why they stopped, and it acknowledges a truth about crime and media that is as relevant today as it was in 1918. That a single act of violence, amplified by public attention, can become a contagion. That the story of a crime can be as dangerous as the crime itself. That the Axeman in the end may have been not just a man but an idea that spread to the city like the Spanish flu, infecting minds, inspiring fear, and producing a wave of violence that no one person could have carried out alone. The city of New Orleans lay Axeman for less than 2 years, but the mark he left or they left has never fully healed. The case remains open. No one has ever been formally charged with the Axeman attacks. No one has ever been definitively identified as the killer. The files sit in the archives of the New Orleans Police Department, yellowed and faded, full of dead ends and unanswered questions. And every few years someone picks them up again. A journalist, a historian, a true crime writer. They go through the evidence, they reexamine the suspects, they propose new theories, and they arrive, inevitably, at the same conclusion. We do not know who the Axeman was. We may never know. But there are things we do know. We know that for a brief, terrible period, the people of New Orleans lived in fear of a figure they could not see and could not understand. We know that this fear changed the way they lived. It changed the way they locked their doors. It changed the way they looked at their neighbors. It changed the way they thought about safety and trust, and the thin membrane that separates ordinary life from horror. We know that the Axeman killed at least 6 people and injured many more. We know that he destroyed families, that he orphaned children, that he shattered the sense of security that the Italian community had worked so hard to build. And we know that he was never held accountable for any of it. And yet, despite the horror, despite the blood, despite the unanswered questions, there is something about the Axeman case that goes beyond the simple mechanics of crime and investigation. There is something about it that touches on deeper questions. Questions about the nature of fear. Questions about the way communities respond to threats they cannot understand. Questions about the role of media in shaping the stories we tell ourselves about the darkness in the world. And questions about what happens to a city, to its identity and its soul, when it is forced to confront the reality that something monstrous is living among its people and that no one can stop it. Let us begin with the fear. Fear is a strange thing. It is one of the oldest emotions. It exists in every culture, every species, every corner of the living world. Fear is what keeps the rabbit running from the fox. Fear is what keeps the child from touching the hot stove. Fear is useful. It is protective. It is in many ways the most important emotion a living creature can have, because without fear, nothing survives for very long. But fear can also be destructive. When fear becomes chronic, when it settles into the bones and refuses to leave, it changes people. It makes them suspicious. It makes them paranoid. It makes them see threats where none exist. And it makes them do things they would never do under normal circumstances. Things like accusing innocent neighbors of murder. Rosie Cortimiglia's false accusation of the Giordano family was, in many ways, a product of fear. Not the immediate physical fear of the attack itself, though that was certainly a factor, but the deeper, more corrosive fear that comes from living in a world where the rules no longer apply. Where a man can come into your home in the middle of the night and kill your child and disappear without a trace. Where the police cannot help you and the locks on your doors are meaningless and the person who did this to you is still out there somewhere, breathing the same air, walking the same streets, looking at the same sky. That kind of fear does not just frighten you. It destabilizes you. It makes the ground shift beneath your feet. It makes you question everything you thought you knew about the world and your place in it. And when the ground is shifting, people reach for anything solid. They reach for explanations, even false ones. They reach for villains, even innocent ones. They reach for certainty, even when certainty is a lie. Rosie Cortimiglia needed someone to blame. She needed the attack on her family to have a face, a name, a reason, and so she gave it one. She pointed at the Giordanos and said they did it, and for a while the lie held. It held because the city needed it to hold, because the alternative, that the Axeman was a faceless, nameless, motiveless force that could strike anyone at any time, was too terrifying to accept. The Cortimiglia case is a window into the social dynamics of fear. It shows us how fear can distort perception, corrupt memory, and poison relationships. Rosie and the Giordanos had been neighbors. They had lived across the street from each other. Their children had probably played together. They had probably borrowed cups of sugar and shared recipes and waved to each other on Sunday mornings. They were part of the same community, the same fabric, and fear tore that fabric apart. It turned neighbors into enemies. It turned a grieving mother into a perjurer. It turned an elderly man and his son into convicted criminals. Fear did not just empower the Axeman, it did his work for him. It spread the damage far beyond the reach of his axe. Every accusation, every rumor, every suspicious glance between neighbors was a wound inflicted not by the Axeman's blade, but by the fear he had planted in the hearts of the people. And the fear was not limited to the Italian community. It spread across the entire city. New Orleans in 1918 and 1909 was a city where everyone was on edge. The war, the flu, the Axeman. It was as if the universe had decided to test the limits of what one city could endure. People who had never given a thought to the security of their homes suddenly became obsessed with locks and bolts and window latches. People who had always slept soundly began waking at every creak, every groan, every rustle of leaves outside the bedroom window. The night itself became a source of anxiety. In a city that had always celebrated the night, that had always come alive after dark with music and laughter and the clinking of glasses, the night was now something to be endured rather than enjoyed. The Axeman had stolen the night from New Orleans. He had taken the city's most cherished hours and filled them with dread. The police response to the Axeman case is also worth examining in greater detail, because it reveals the limitations not just of the technology of the era, but of the institutional structures that were supposed to protect the public. The New Orleans Police Department in 1918 was a product of its time. It was underfunded, understaffed, and riddled with corruption. Officers were poorly trained, equipment was outdated. Communication between precincts was slow and unreliable. The chain of command was often unclear, with political appointees holding positions of authority over more experienced officers. And the department's relationship with the city's immigrant communities was at best strained. This last point is crucial. The Axeman's victims were predominantly Italian immigrants. They lived in neighborhoods that the police viewed with suspicion, and in some cases, outright hostility. The police were not entirely wrong to be wary of certain elements within the Italian community. The Black Hand was real. The mafia was real. There were genuine criminal networks operating within the Italian neighborhoods, and these networks did pose a threat to public safety. But the police response to Italian crime was colored by prejudice in ways that made effective investigation difficult. Instead of seeing the Italian community as a population in need of protection, many officers saw it as a population in need of policing. The distinction is important. When you are trying to protect a community, you listen to its members. You build trust. You make people feel safe enough to come forward with information. When you are trying to police a community, you interrogate its members. You treat them as suspects. You make them feel like the enemy. And when people feel like the enemy, they do not cooperate. They do not share information. They do not open their doors when the police come knocking. They close them. This dynamic played out repeatedly during the Axeman investigation. The police needed information from the Italian community. They needed people to come forward and tell them what they had seen, what they had heard, what they suspected. But the Italian community did not trust the police, and the police, in turn, did not trust the Italian community. Each side viewed the other with suspicion, and this mutual suspicion created a void of communication that the Axeman exploited. He operated in the spaces between, in the gaps where information should have flowed but did not, in the silence between a community that was afraid to speak and an institution that was not really listening. The media played its own complicated role in the Axeman saga. The newspapers of New Orleans in 1918 and 1919 were not the restrained, fact-checked publications that we might imagine when we think of journalism. They were sensational, competitive, and sometimes reckless. They competed fiercely for readers, and the Axeman story was the biggest story in town. Every attack was covered in lurid detail. Every theory was published, no matter how outlandish. Every rumor was treated as potentially newsworthy. The newspapers gave the Axeman his name. They gave him his mythology. They turned a series of brutal but ultimately local crimes into a narrative of epic proportions. The Axeman was not just a criminal. He was a monster, a demon, a supernatural force. The newspapers built him up into something larger than life, and in doing so they amplified the fear that was already gripping the city. This amplification had real consequences. It made the police investigation harder by flooding the department with false leads and hysterical reports. Every night, the police received calls from citizens who were sure they had seen the Axeman. He was on their porch. He was in their yard. He was standing on the corner, watching their store. In the vast majority of cases, these reports turned out to be nothing. A neighbor coming home late, a stray cat knocking over a garbage can, a shadow cast by a streetlight. But each report had to be investigated, and each investigation consumed time and resources that the police did not have. The newspapers, by feeding the public's fear, had created a flood of noise that made it nearly impossible for the police to hear the signal. The real clues, the genuine sightings, the legitimate pieces of evidence, were buried under an avalanche of panic. The publication of the Axeman's letter in the Times-Picayune is the most dramatic example of the media's role in the case. Whether the letter was genuine or a hoax, the newspaper's decision to publish it in full had enormous consequences. It transformed the Axeman from a local criminal into a national sensation. It gave the killer, or someone claiming to be the killer, a platform from which to address the entire city. And it created the conditions for the remarkable Jazz Night of 1919, which was simultaneously an act of community defiance and an act of mass compliance with the demands of a serial killer. The newspaper, by publishing the letter, had become a participant in the story rather than merely a chronicler of it. And in doing so, it had blurred the line between journalism and spectacle in a way that would become increasingly common in the decades to come. The Jazz Night itself deserves further reflection. It is one of the most written about episodes in the entire Axeman saga, and for good reason. It is a moment that captures something essential about the spirit of New Orleans. But it is also a moment that is more complicated than it might appear at first glance. On the surface, it looks like a triumph. The city came together. The people played their music and danced in the streets and refused to be cowed by a madman with an axe. It was beautiful. It was quintessentially New Orleans. But look a little deeper, and the picture becomes less straightforward. The Jazz Night was, in a very real sense, a surrender. Not a surrender to fear, but a surrender to the Axeman's narrative. The Axeman, through his letter, had positioned himself as a figure of power, a being who could command the city to play music and the city would obey. And the city did obey. It played music. It danced. It did exactly what the letter told it to do. Yes, it did so with style and defiance and a spirit of community that turned a mandate into a celebration. But the fact remains that the Axeman gave an order and the city followed it. The power dynamic was clear. The Axeman was in control. He had demonstrated that he could manipulate an entire city through words alone, that he did not need his axe to exert power. He could do it with a letter and a newspaper. This is a deeply uncomfortable realization. It suggests that the Axeman understood something about mass psychology that the police and the public did not. He understood that fear is not just about physical danger. It is about control. The person who controls the narrative controls the fear, and the person who controls the fear controls the population. The Axeman's letter was not just a threat. It was a demonstration of mastery, a proof of concept. He had shown that he could make an entire city dance to his tune, literally, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. The Jazz Night was not a defeat of the Axeman. It was his greatest victory. Or was it? There is another way to read the Jazz Night, and it is a reading that is more generous to the people of New Orleans. Perhaps the city's response was not compliance but transformation. Perhaps the people of New Orleans took the Axeman's threat and turned it into something he never intended. He wanted fear. They gave him a party. He wanted submission. They gave him celebration. He wanted silence and cowering and the sound of doors being locked and hearts racing in the dark. They gave him trumpets and trombones and laughter and dancing. In this reading, the Jazz Night was not about obeying the Axeman's command. It was about refusing to let the Axeman define the terms of the encounter. He said, "Play jazz or die." They said, "We will play jazz because that is who we are." The music was not a response to the threat. It was a reassertion of identity, a declaration that New Orleans would be New Orleans, regardless of what any killer demanded. Both readings are valid. Both capture something true about the event. and the tension between them, between compliance and defiance, between fear and courage, between the Axeman's power and the city's resilience, is what makes the jazz night such a rich and enduring moment in American cultural history. It is a moment that resists simple interpretation, a moment that means different things to different people, a moment that reveals as much about the interpreter as it does about the event itself. Now, let us return to the investigation and to the final months of the Axeman's activity, because the story is not yet complete. There are details that have been overlooked and connections that have been missed. And there is a thread running through the case that ties many of the loose ends together. Even if it does not produce a definitive conclusion, one of the most puzzling aspects of the Axeman case is the role of women. Several of the attacks involved women in ways that complicate the standard narrative. Harriet Lowe accused Louis Bezumer of attacking her, an accusation that may or may not have been true. Rosie Cortimiglia accused the Giordano family, an accusation that was definitively false. Esther Albano, the widow of Mike Pepitone, traveled across the country and shot Joseph Mumford, the man she believed was the Axeman. In each of these cases, a woman took dramatic, decisive action in response to the attacks, and in each case, that action was met with a complicated mix of sympathy and skepticism from the public and the authorities. Harriet Lowe's accusation against Bezumer was initially taken seriously but gradually lost credibility as she changed her story multiple times. She was seen as unreliable, hysterical, a woman who could not be trusted to tell the truth. Whether this perception was justified is debatable. Lowe had suffered a catastrophic head injury that could certainly have affected her memory and her judgment, but the ease with which her testimony was dismissed also reflects the broader attitudes of the era toward women's credibility. Women in 1918 were not treated as reliable witnesses, particularly when their testimony conflicted with that of a man. Lowe said Bezumer attacked her. Bezumer said he did not, and in the end the jury believed Bezumer. Rosie Cortimiglia's accusation was more dramatic and more consequential. She lied under oath and sent 2 innocent men to prison. Her lie was eventually exposed, but only after the Giordanos had spent months behind bars. Rosie's case is often cited as an example of the dangers of false testimony, and it is that. But it is also a case study in the psychology of trauma. Rosie had watched her daughter die in her arms. She had suffered a head injury that left her in and out of consciousness for days. She was consumed by grief and rage and the desperate need to make sense of something that made no sense. In her fractured state, she reached for the nearest available explanation, however false, and clung to it with the tenacity of a drowning person clinging to a piece of driftwood. Her lie was not calculated. It was instinctive, a survival mechanism, a way of imposing order on chaos. And when the lie finally became too heavy to carry, when the guilt overwhelmed the grief, she confessed. She walked into the newspaper office and told the truth. It was the bravest thing she ever did, and it was far too late. Esther Albano's story is the most dramatic of the 3. She is the only person in the entire Axeman saga who took direct, violent action against a suspected perpetrator. She did not wait for the police. She did not wait for the courts. She saw the man she believed had killed her husband, and she shot him. It was vigilante justice of the most raw and primal kind. An eye for an eye. A life for a life. The fact that she may have been wrong, that Mumford may not have been the Axeman, does not diminish the emotional power of her act. She believed she was avenging her husband. She believed she was doing what the police had failed to do. And in a city where the police had indeed failed, spectacularly and repeatedly, her action resonated with a public that was hungry for resolution. The women of the Axeman case are not footnotes. They are central to the story. They are the ones who carried the heaviest emotional burdens. They are the ones who suffered the most devastating losses. They are the ones who took the most dramatic actions, for better or for worse. And they are the ones whose stories reveal the most about the human impact of the Axeman's crimes. The Axeman attacked bodies, but it was the women who bore the wounds of the spirit, the wounds that do not heal, the wounds that change who you are and how you see the world and whether you can ever feel safe again. The investigation, such as it was, continued in a desultory fashion for years after the last attack. The police never officially closed the case. They simply stopped working on it. There were no new leads. There were no new suspects. There were no new attacks. The Axeman had vanished, and without new activity, the investigation had no fuel. It sputtered and stalled and eventually ground to a halt, like a car running out of gasoline on a long, empty road. But the case never truly went cold in the minds of the people who had lived through it. The survivors carried their memories like stones in their pockets. Heavy, constant, impossible to put down. Charles Cortimiglia, who had survived that killed his daughter, lived the rest of his life in the shadow of that night. The physical scars healed more or less. The wound on his head closed the fracture and his skull knit itself back together. But the other scars, the ones you cannot see, the ones that live in the space behind the eyes, those never healed. He was a different man after the attack, quieter, more withdrawn, less trusting. The grocer who had once stood behind his counter and greeted every customer by name became a man who flinched at loud sounds and could not sleep without a light on. The Axeman had taken more than his daughter from him. He had taken his sense of the world as a fundamentally safe place. And once that sense is gone, it does not come back. It is like a mirror that has been cracked. You can glue it back together. You can hang it on the wall and stand in front of it and see your reflection. But the crack is always there, running through the image, distorting the light, reminding you that the whole thing could shatter again at any moment. The other survivors had similar experiences. Anna Schneider, who was attacked while pregnant, gave birth to a healthy daughter and went on to live a long life. But she never forgot the shadow she had seen standing over her bed. She never forgot the sensation of waking up to pain and blood and confusion. She never forgot the terror of not knowing what had happened or why. Steve Boca, who survived his attack and stumbled through the streets to find help, was haunted by the gap in his memory. He knew something tore the gap into him. He had the wound to prove it. But he could not remember the attack itself. He could not picture his attacker's face. He could not recall the sound of the axe or the moment of impact. His mind had protected him by erasing the worst part of the experience, but the erasure itself was a source of anguish. He knew that something was in his head, something terrible. Something his brain had locked away in a room he could not open. And the knowledge that it was there, hidden but present, was its own form of torture. Sarah Lahman, the young woman who lived alone on North Dorgenoy Street, recovered from her injuries but moved away from New Orleans shortly after. She could not stay in the house where she had been attacked. She could not stay in the city where the Axeman had come for her. She packed her things and left, and she did not come back. This was a common response among the survivors. Many of them moved. They left their homes, their neighborhoods, their communities. They went to other cities, other states. They tried to put distance between themselves and the memories. Some of them changed their names. Some of them never spoke about what had happened to them. They buried the experience as deep as they could and tried to build new lives on top of the burial site. But the ground was never stable. The past was always there, just beneath the surface, waiting to break through. The families of the dead carried an even heavier burden. The Maggio family lost Joseph and Catherine in a single night. They lost a brother and a sister, in-law to violence so sudden and so savage that it defied comprehension. Andrew Maggio, who had found the bodies, lived with the image of that bedroom for the rest of his life. The blood, the wounds, the sound of his brother's last breath. These are the things that visit you at 3 a.m, when the house is quiet and the darkness closes in. These are the things that no amount of time can soften. Andrew had done nothing wrong. He had simply been in the next apartment. He had simply heard a sound and gone to investigate. And for that simple act of fraternal concern, he was rewarded with a vision of horror that would never leave him. The Pepitone family lost Mike. His wife lost her husband, his children lost their father. And in the aftermath, his wife was driven to an act of violence that landed her in prison. The Axeman had not just killed Mike Pepitone. He had set in motion a chain of events that would unravel the entire family. The widow became a killer. The children became orphans, in effect with their father dead and their mother in prison. The family that Mike Pepitone had worked so hard to build was destroyed, not just by the axe, by everything that came after the axe, by the grief and the rage and the desperate, futile search for justice, and the Cortimiglia family. What can be said about the Cortimiglia family that has not already been said? They lost Mary, their 2-year-old daughter baby, the child who had done nothing to anyone, the child who was asleep in her mother's arms when the axe came down. There is no way to describe the magnitude of that loss. There are no words in any language that are adequate to the task. The death of a child is the worst thing that can happen to a parent. It is a wound that does not close, a grief does not diminish, a darkness that does not lift. And in the Cortimiglia case, the grief was compounded by the chaos that followed. The false accusation, the trial, the conviction of innocent men, the eventual recantation, the public humiliation. Rosie Cortimiglia did not just lose her daughter, she lost herself. She became a different person, a person consumed by grief and guilt and rage, a person who lied under oath and sent innocent men to prison, and then confessed and unraveled and wandered the streets weeping. The Axeman did not just kill Mary Cortimiglia. He destroyed the entire family. He left behind a wreckage of broken people and broken relationships that could never be fully repaired. These are the real victims of the Axeman. Not statistics. Not names on a list. Not characters in a story. Real people with real lives and real families and real dreams that were shattered by a force they could not see and could not understand. The Axeman took lives, he took limbs. He took memories, he took peace of mind. He took the sense of safety that allows a person to close their eyes at night and trust that they will open them again in the morning. He took all of these things, and he gave nothing in return. No reason, no motive, just absence. The absence of answers, the absence of justice, the absence of closure, and that absence, more than anything else, is what defines the Axeman case. It is a story defined not by what is known but by what is not known, not by what was found but by what was lost. The Axeman of New Orleans has been dead for a long time now. Whoever he was, whatever name he answered to in the daylight hours when he was not crawling through back doors with a chisel in his hand, he has been in the ground for decades. The world he moved through, the New Orleans of 1918 and 1919, with its horse-drawn carts and its gaslit streets and its party-line telephones and its newspapers hawked on corners by boys in caps, that world is gone too. It has been replaced by a city that is in many ways unrecognizable from the one the Axeman stalked. The streets have been paved, the gas lights have been replaced by electric ones. The grocery stores, those small family-run operations where the husband stood behind the counter and the wife kept the books and the children stocked the shelves. Most of those are gone now, replaced by chain supermarkets and convenience stores. The shotgun houses where the Italian families lived and died are still standing in some neighborhoods, but many of them have been renovated beyond recognition or torn down altogether. The physical landscape of the Axeman's hunting ground has been transformed, but the story has not gone away. If anything, the story of the Axeman of New Orleans has grown in the telling. It has become one of the foundational narratives of the city, a dark thread woven into the fabric of New Orleans' identity, alongside the jazz and the Mardi Gras and the voodoo and the ghosts and all the other elements that make the city unlike any other place in America. The Axeman is part of the mythology now. He belongs to New Orleans in the same way that Jack the Ripper belongs to London. He is the city's monster, its unsolved nightmare, the shadow that flickers at the edge of the lamplight. The case has been examined and re-examined countless times over the past century. Books have been written about it, documentaries have been filmed, podcasts have devoted multiple episodes to dissecting the evidence and debating the theories. Academic papers have been published. True crime enthusiasts from around the world have studied the case, argued about it, and proposed their own solutions. The internet, which did not exist when the Axeman was active, has given the case a second life. Online forums are filled with discussions about the identity of the killer, the reliability of the evidence, the plausibility of the various theories. Amateur detectives with access to historical records and genealogical databases have tried to crack the case from their living rooms, following leads that the original investigators never had the tools to pursue. The Axeman has become a collaborative mystery, a puzzle that the whole world is trying to solve, And yet, despite all of this attention, the case remains stubbornly, maddeningly unsolved. Every theory has its strengths and its weaknesses. Every suspect has evidence both for and against. Every lead, no matter how promising, eventually runs into a wall. The Axeman has defeated every attempt to identify him in life and in death. He is the ghost that cannot be caught, the riddle that cannot be answered, the door that cannot be opened. Part of the reason for this is the passage of time. The Axeman case is now more than 100 years old. The witnesses are all dead. The crime scenes have been altered or demolished. The physical evidence, what little of it there was, has degraded or been lost. The police files, while still extant, are incomplete and in some cases illegible. The chain of custody for key pieces of evidence was broken long ago. Even if a researcher were to identify a compelling suspect today, it is unlikely that the identification could ever be confirmed to the standard of proof that a court of law would require. The Axeman case is not just cold, it is frozen, encased in a block of ice that grows thicker with every passing year. But the impossibility of a definitive solution has not diminished interest in the case. If anything, it has increased it, because there is something about an unsolved mystery that is more compelling than a solved one. A solved mystery is satisfying. It provides closure. It answers the questions and ties up the loose ends and allows the mind to move on. But an unsolved mystery is alive. It continues to provoke thought and debate and speculation. It refuses to be filed away and forgotten. It demands attention. It insists on being revisited. And the Axeman case, with its vivid characters and its dramatic set pieces and its tantalizing clues and its frustrating dead ends, is one of the most compelling unsolved mysteries in the history of American crime. Let us revisit some of the key questions that remain unanswered. Not because we can answer them, but because the act of asking them reveals something about the case and about the nature of mystery itself. The first question is the most basic. Who was the Axeman? We have discussed the suspects: Joseph Mumford, Louis Bezumer, various unnamed individuals seen near the crime scenes. Various mafia figures proposed by researchers over the years, but none of these candidates is fully convincing. Mumford is the closest to a plausible suspect, but the evidence against him is circumstantial and the identification by Esther Albano is questionable. Bezumer was acquitted, and the physical evidence at his crime scene is more consistent with a break-in than with a staged attack. The mafia theories are intriguing but do not account for all of the evidence. And the unnamed suspects, the dark figures seen lurking near the crime scenes, are too vague to be useful. The truth is that the Axeman could have been any of these people. Or none of them. He could have been someone who was never considered as a suspect. Someone who lived a quiet, unremarkable life in some other part of the city, and who never attracted the attention of the police or the press. Someone who hid his darkness behind a mask of normalcy so perfect that no one ever suspected him. This is the most terrifying possibility. Not that the Axeman was a known criminal who slipped through the cracks of the justice system, but that he was an ordinary person, a neighbor, a coworker, a churchgoer. Someone you would pass on the street without a second glance. Someone whose face you would forget the moment you looked away. The banality of evil is not just a philosophical concept. It is a practical reality. The most dangerous people in the world are often the ones who look the most normal. The second question is about motive. Why did the Axeman do what he did? We have discussed several possible motives: mafia extortion, racial hatred, personal grudges, compulsive paraphilic behavior. Each of these explanations has some support in the evidence, but none of them fully explains the totality of the crimes. The mafia theory does not account for the non-Italian victims or the ritualistic method. The racial hatred theory does not account for the silence of the attacks, the absence of expressive elements. The personal grudge theory requires identifying a specific target, which has not been possible, and the compulsive behavior theory, while consistent with the ritualistic elements, does not explain the targeting of Italian grocers specifically. The motive remains unknown. And in the absence of a known motive, the Axeman's crimes take on an almost existential quality. They seem motiveless. Acts of destruction that serve no discernible end. This is what makes them so frightening. A crime with a motive can be understood. It can be predicted. It can be prevented. A crime without a motive is a force of nature. It strikes where it strikes, and there is nothing you can do to stop it. The third question is about the letter. Did the Axeman really write the letter that was published in the Times Picayune? This question has been debated for a century, and there is still no consensus. The letter is stylistically inconsistent with the crimes. The crimes were silent, efficient, and anonymous. The letter was theatrical, verbose, and attention-seeking. It is difficult to reconcile the personality revealed by the letter with the personality revealed by the crimes. They seem to belong to different people. And yet, the letter contained details that were consistent with the Axeman's behavior. The writer claimed to be a supernatural entity who could not be stopped by locks or bullets. The Axeman did indeed seem to be able to enter any home, regardless of the locks on the doors. The writer expressed a love of jazz. The Axeman's attacks were concentrated in neighborhoods where jazz was a central part of the culture. These consistencies do not prove that the Axeman wrote the letter, but they do not disprove it either. The letter hangs in a state of permanent ambiguity. It is either the most revealing document in the entire case, a window into the mind of the killer himself, or it is a hoax that has nothing to do with the actual crimes. And we cannot tell which. The fourth question is about the earlier attacks. Were the attacks on Italian grocers in 1911 committed by the same person who carried out the attacks in 1919? If so, the Axeman's career stretches over nearly a decade, which would make him one of the longest operating serial offenders of the early 20th century. The method was similar. The victims were similar. But 7 years is a long gap between clusters of attacks. What was the Axeman doing during those 7 years? Was he in prison? Was he in another city, carrying out similar attacks that were never connected to the New Orleans crimes? Was he suppressing his urges, fighting against the compulsion, trying to live a normal life? Or was he simply inactive, dormant like a volcano between eruptions, the pressure building slowly beneath the surface until it finally burst through again? The 1911 attacks add another layer of complexity to an already complex case. If they are included in the Axeman's body of work, the total number of attacks increases significantly, and the time frame expands from roughly 18 months to nearly a decade. This changes the profile of the offender considerably. It suggests someone who was active for a very long time. Someone who was able to maintain his dual existence, normal citizen by day, predator by night, for years without being detected. Someone with extraordinary self-control. Someone who could turn the urge on and off, or at least manage it well enough to avoid attracting suspicion during the periods when he was not actively hunting. This is a profile that is consistent with some of the most prolific serial offenders in history. Offenders who killed decades before being caught, or who were never caught at all. The Axeman, if he was responsible for the 1911 attacks as well as the later ones, may have been one of these. A long-term predator who operated for years in the shadows of a city that never fully understood what was happening to it. The fifth question is about the end. Why did the attacks stop? This is perhaps the most tantalizing question of all. Serial offenders who are driven by compulsion do not typically stop voluntarily. The urge does not go away. It does not weaken with time. If anything, it tends to intensify. The intervals between crimes grow shorter. The violence escalates. The risks become greater. The offender spirals downward, driven by a need that can never be fully satisfied, until he is either caught or killed or incapacitated by age or illness. For the attacks to stop suddenly and permanently, as they did after the Pepitone murder in October 1919, something must have happened to the Axeman, something that removed him from the equation. The most common explanations are death, imprisonment, or relocation. If the Axeman died in late 1919 or early 1920, that would explain the cessation of attacks. But there is no record of a suspicious death in New Orleans during that period that can be connected to the case. If the Axeman was imprisoned for an unrelated crime, that too would explain the cessation. But no one in the New Orleans prison system during that period has been convincingly linked to the Axeman crimes. And if the Axeman relocated to another city, then presumably the attacks would have continued in the new location. but no series of attacks matching the Axeman's method have identified in any other American city during the early 1920s. The cessation remains a mystery. It is the final silence, the last unanswered question, and like all the other unanswered questions in this case, it invites speculation without providing confirmation. We can guess, we can theorize, we can construct elaborate scenarios that explain why the attack stopped, but we cannot prove any of them. The Axeman's final act was his disappearance, and that disappearance was as complete and as inexplicable as everything else about him. There is, however, one more thread to follow, one more story to tell, and it is a story that takes us beyond the facts of the case and into the realm of legacy. Because the Axeman of New Orleans did not just leave behind victims and unanswered questions. He left behind a cultural imprint that has shaped the way New Orleans thinks about itself and the way the world thinks about New Orleans. The Axeman is in many ways the perfect New Orleans villain. He emerged from the city's unique cultural landscape, a landscape defined by the collision of multiple immigrant communities, by the omnipresence of music, by the proximity of life and death, by the thin membrane between the sacred and the profane. He attacked the city at its most vulnerable, in the homes where families slept, in the neighborhoods where communities gathered, in the hours when the music stopped and the darkness settled in. And the city responded in the most New Orleans way possible. It threw a party, played jazz. It danced in the streets. The Axeman and the city's response to him have become a story about the character of New Orleans itself. A story about resilience, about defiance, about the refusal to let fear silence the music. It is a beautiful story. It is also a simplification. But simplifications are how cities build their identities. They take the messy, complicated, often painful reality of their history, and they shape it into a narrative that reflects who they want to be. New Orleans wants to be the city that played jazz when a serial killer told them to. And so that is the story it tells. The Axeman has been incorporated into the city's cultural life in ways both obvious and subtle. There are walking tours that visit the sites of the attacks. There are bars and restaurants named after him. There are books and films and television shows that fictionalize his story. There are songs that reference him. He has become a character in the ongoing drama of New Orleans, a city that has always had a complicated relationship with its own darkness. New Orleans does not hide from its ghosts. It invites them in. It sets a place for them at the table. It pours them a drink and asks them to tell their stories. And the Axeman, that most elusive of ghosts, has accepted the invitation. He sits at the table, he drinks his drink, and he says nothing. Because that is the one thing the Axeman has always been best at: silence. The case also has broader significance for the history of criminal investigation in America. It is one of the earliest cases that can be classified, in retrospect, as a serial murder investigation. The concept of serial murder did not exist in 1918. The term itself would not be coined for decades. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, which would eventually develop the techniques of criminal profiling that are now standard practice in serial murder investigations, would not be established until the 1970s. The police who investigated the Axeman case were working without any of the conceptual frameworks that modern investigators take for granted. They did not know they were dealing with a serial offender. They did not understand the psychology of serial violence. They did not have the vocabulary to describe what they were seeing. Each attack was treated as a separate crime, investigated by different detectives with little coordination or information sharing between cases. The idea that all of the attacks might be the work of one person was discussed, but it was not the organizing principle of the investigation. There was no task force, no central command, no unified theory of the case. The investigation was fragmented, and that fragmentation allowed the Axeman to operate with relative impunity. In this sense, the Axeman case is a cautionary tale. It shows us what happens when a serial offender operates in an environment that is not equipped to deal with serial offending. The police were not incompetent. They were simply working within a paradigm that did not include the concept of a serial killer. They were trying to solve a series of murders using the tools and assumptions of single murder investigations. And the result was predictable. Each case was treated in isolation. Leads that might have connected the cases were not pursued, because the connections were not recognized. Patterns that might have identified the offender were not detected, because no one was looking for patterns. The Axeman exploited the gaps in the system, the spaces between cases, the silences between investigations, just as he exploited the gaps in the back doors of his victims' homes. He was a predator who thrived in the margins. And the margins in 1918 were very wide indeed. The Axeman case also raises important questions about the relationship between media and crime. The newspapers of 1910 and 1919 played a central role in shaping the public perception of the Axeman. They created the narrative. They named the killer. They published his purported letter. They stoked the fear and then covered the fear as if it were a separate story. They turned a series of local crimes into a national sensation. And in doing so, they may have made the investigation harder and the killer more dangerous. The media coverage gave the Axeman a platform. It gave him an audience. It gave him a name and a mythology and a place in the public imagination. And for a certain type of offender, that kind of attention is not a deterrent, it is fuel. It is validation. It is the thing that makes the risk worthwhile. Whether the Axeman was that type of offender, whether he read the newspaper articles and felt a surge of pride and satisfaction at seeing his work described in breathless, terrified prose, we cannot know. But the possibility is there, and it raises uncomfortable questions about the role of the media in the ecology of crime. Questions that are just as relevant today. In the age of 24-hour news cycles and social media and true crime podcasts, as they were in the age of the newsboy and the broadsheet. We who tell these stories, who dissect these cases, who examine the evidence and debate the theories and try to understand what happened and why, we are part of this ecology too. We are the latest link in a chain that stretches back to the reporters who first wrote about the Axeman in 1918. We are keeping the story alive. We are keeping the mystery open. We are keeping the questions burning. And in doing so, we are performing a service. We are honoring the victims by refusing to let their stories be forgotten. We are holding space for the unanswered questions, refusing to let them be swept away by the passage of time. We are insisting that these cases matter, that these people mattered, that the Italian grocers and their families, who were so often dismissed and marginalized in their own time, deserve to be remembered. Their names deserve to be spoken. Their stories deserve to be told. Joseph and Catherine Maggio, Louis Bezumer and Harriet Lowe, Anna Schneider, Joseph Romano, Charles and Rosie and little Mary Cortimiglia, Steve Boca, Sarah Lahman, Mike Pepitone. These are the names of the people the Axeman touched. Some of them survived. Some did not. All of them were changed. All of them carried the mark of the axe for the rest of their lives. Whether that mark was visible on their bodies or hidden in the deep, unreachable places of their minds. They did not ask to be part of this story. They did not choose to be characters in a mystery that would be debated for a century. They were just people, living their lives, running their stores, raising their children, sleeping in their beds. And then, one night, the darkness came for them. A chisel in the door, a panel removed, a shadow moving through the house, an axe raised in the dim light. And then everything changed, everything. The Axeman took their peace. He took their safety. He took their innocence. He took the trust that allows a person to live in a community and feel that they belong. He took all of these things and left nothing in return but fear and grief and questions that will never be answered. That is his legacy, not the jazz night, not the letter, not the mystery. His legacy is the pain he caused, the lives he destroyed, the families he shattered, the community he terrorized. That is what the Axeman left behind. And no amount of time, no number of books or documentaries or podcast episodes can undo it. But there is one thing we can do. We can remember, we can say their names, we can tell their stories. We can refuse to let them be reduced to footnotes in a mystery. We can insist that they were real people with real lives who deserve so much better than what they got. And we can hope, however faintly, that someday, somewhere, someone will find the answer that has eluded us for more than 100 years. That someday the Axeman will have a name, and that when he does, the victims and their families will finally have something they have been denied for far too long: justice. The streets of New Orleans are quiet now. The grocery stores where the Italian families worked and lived and died have mostly disappeared. The back doors that the Axeman chiseled through have been replaced or torn down. The neighborhoods have changed. 100 years have passed, and the city has survived things far worse than one man with an axe. It has survived hurricanes that swallowed entire neighborhoods. It has survived floods that turned streets into rivers. It has survived plagues and poverty in the slow, grinding erosion of time. And through all of it, the music has never stopped. That is the thing about New Orleans. The music never stops. It did not stop for Axeman in 1919, and it has not stopped since. The trumpets still play on Frenchman Street. The brass bands still march through the quarter. The second lines still win through the neighborhoods on Sunday afternoons, the umbrellas spinning, the feet moving, the drums beating out a rhythm that is older than memory. New Orleans endures. It always has. It always will, and somewhere in the archives, in a dusty file cabinet in a building that smells of old paper and mildew, the Axeman case sits waiting. Unsolved. Unfinished. The names of the dead are written there in faded ink. The names of the living, the survivors who carried their scars to the grave, are there too. And the name of the killer is not there. It has never been there. It may never be there. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this case, leave a comment and subscribe. Good night and stay safe.